Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to Populist Podcast. I'm Chase.
And I'm Charles.
And today we're joined by a very special guest, Shahid Buttar, who's running to unseat Speaker Nancy Pelosi in California's 12th Congressional District. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me with you. It's a pleasure to join you.
All right, I'm going to get the ball rolling. Do you want to go ahead and tell us about yourself, why you're running, where you're from?
Sure. I'm an immigrant, constitutional lawyer, and artist. Grew up in rural Missouri and came both from there and the south side of Chicago to the Bay Area 20 years ago to study and then teach law at Stanford. I've spent the last 20 years using my legal training to fight for our rights, both in the courts as well as in the policy arena. I've led nonprofits dedicated to fighting mass surveillance. I was an early advocate for marriage equality well before the Democratic establishment. I've been an active participant in the movements for Black lives, immigrant rights, peace and justice around the world in the face of U.S. militarism, climate justice. And I've seen, unfortunately, the democratically elected voice of San Francisco in Congress undermine those values and those movements quite consistently for 20 years. And I'm not willing to be misrepresented in Washington anymore, whether it's needing to defend our democracy from the threat of consolidating fascism under our feet, or whether it's the opportunity to breathe into being the agenda that will defend the future from the failures of our corporate past. I'm ready and eager to do the job of representing San Francisco in Congress.
All right. Well, a few weeks ago, your district held its primary. You claimed enough support to move on to the general election. However, you trailed Speaker Pelosi by a margin of almost 60%. How do you plan to build enough support in the coming months to overcome this, as well as a $6 million fundraising deficit?
A big part of it are interviews like this, getting the word out. The reason that Pelosi had such a lead on it basically is that she is one of the most well-known political figures in the country. And while her failures are as well known as her name, they're not generally associated with her. So we ultimately need to get the word out across the city about the reality of her representation. And that stands in very sharp tension with the narrative that people hear on cable news. So a big part of the strategy is knocking on doors across the district over the next 8 months to spread that message, expand awareness of our campaign. As you can imagine, the pandemic punches a hole in the sort of traditional backbone of that strategy, which is knocking on doors. So we're spending a lot of time on the phone. We're spending a lot of time online. I'm still, volunteering in the community with food banks and whatnot, doing what I can to help through the pandemic. But at the end of the day, we have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of awareness to raise, and a lot of minds to unplug from a corporate matrix, ultimately. I think a lot of people see Pelosi as the face of I'm using air quotes here, so-called resistance to a kleptocratic president. And at the end of the day, she gets credit from a lot of people for showing up late to an impeachment process that she artificially limited and as a result lost when she could have won it. And the only reason this tyrant is still in office, frankly, is because of the failures, the preventable failures of Nancy Pelosi. And it does me no joy to say that 6 months before she finally showed up for impeachment, I wrote an article. It was shared virally by our nation's leading authority on constitutional law. It spelled out in no uncertain terms how to impeach the president. And it's exactly what she refused to do when she did finally show up. I said then, when she did finally show up, that this strategy she has formulated is doomed to fail because it doesn't invoke the president's corruption. And that's how you bring him down, not the partisan crime of foreign interference in a U.S. election. Yes, it's a crime. Yes, it should be impeachable. Impeachment's a political process. She failed. That's just one example of the failure. I think the pandemic, at the same time that it punches a hole in our field plan, it also makes the case for us about why San Francisco needs a new voice in Congress, right? We're one of the country's most progressive cities, if not the most progressive city in the nation. There is a bill that would establish free healthcare as a human right across the country. It's supported by a majority of Democrats in the caucus, and it's never been the subject of a vote in the House precisely because Nancy Pelosi opposes it. And if there were anything to make very inescapably clear that healthcare is not a commodity in which we have individual consumer interests, but rather a crucial public good in which we all share an interest, that is to say, a human right that we should afford using our collective resources, in other words, Medicare for all, the pandemic makes that clearer than anything else could. And a big part of the strategy is to allow the speaker's failures to reveal themselves to the district. A big part of it is reaching out to everyone in the district to make sure they know that our city has a new voice and a new choice. And particularly, I would say in the meantime, doing what we can to show up for the community while we are in this crisis, to do what we can to be helpful in the meantime.
All right. So to follow up on that topic, the median income in your district is in the six-figure range. How do you sell your self-described message of democratic socialism?
Yeah, a lot of very wealthy people are also concerned about our democracy. And at the same time, as socialists, we aspire to, for instance, expand the set of human rights to include not only healthcare, but also housing and food, to expand the share of public ownership of the economy, to contain runaway corporate capital, to limit and ultimately end corporate resource extraction. All those are dimensions of the economic platform of democratic socialism. A lot of people focus on the socialism, though, and they forget the first part. And I often say that as an immigrant constitutional lawyer, if there is a unique contribution that my voice has to Congress, it is the resuscitation of the D in democratic socialism. And it might seem ironic that a party that names itself the Democratic Party might need to be reminded what democracy means, but our democracy is very much in crisis from a whole set of compounding and intersecting vectors. One threat is the erosion of voting rights. There's another threat to the independence of the courts. They hit the republic in opposite directions, one at the majoritarian lever, one at the counter-majoritarian lever. So both, Articles 1 and 3 are eroding at the same time. You've got this executive power grab in Article 2 across administrations from both political parties. There is a constitutional crisis, and it includes not only the loss of judicial independence and the erosion of voting rights, but executive secrecy, impeding judicial review and congressional oversight, as well as, in a completely other dimension, the emergence of a mass surveillance state alongside arbitrary police profiling, inhibiting dissent and silencing dissent in precisely the areas where we most need it. And all that is to say, my democratic socialism is as concerned about authoritarianism as it is about corporate runaway capitalism. And the threat to our species includes not only this pandemic and not only climate chaos and the pattern of our country certainly running our entire species off a cliff as if we were lemmings, but also the gaping maw of fascism and the military industrial fraud, waste, and corruption that continues to waste our civilizational resources while people are going hungry and unsheltered is a travesty. And it's a travesty in which we might have at one point had the opportunity to look the other way. But as I made the point before, our greatest challenges are shared. And unfortunately, or fortunately, for better or worse, we won't have the opportunity to turn a blind eye to that misappropriation of our resources any longer.
All right, so I'm going to get started on some more policy specifics with your campaign. On your website, you have made it clear that you support collective bargaining and unions. With the recent significant drop-off in union membership dating back to the 1980s, how do you propose we re-strengthen them in order to ensure higher wages and workplace standards?
That's a great question, and I so appreciate you raising that. It brings into sharp relief the abandonment of the corporate Democratic Party, of the labor movement, and the worker interests and workers that fuel it. The Democratic Party relies on workers and working class people to vote, to volunteer, to donate to Democratic campaigns. Yet, as you correctly observed, for the better part of 40 years, the Democratic Party has been effectively absent from representing those voters. And just a couple examples of that. There was a bill in the mid-2000s. I still support it. Speaker Pelosi has not brought it to the floor for a vote. It's called the Employee Free Choice Act. It would radically ease the process of forming new unions. There's another bill called the Protecting Right to Organize Act, the PRO Act. I supported it for many months. I'm very grateful to say it has recently passed the House with the new support of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. When it was first introduced, she opposed the bill. We supported it because it would, among other things, end right-to-work laws in the states. It would close loopholes that employers exploit to prevent new unions from forming, and it would increase the penalties that those employers face when they undermine worker rights. And after having opposed that reform, it was about a month and a half ago, Nancy Pelosi flipped, embraced that law. I think the things that forced her to do that include pressure from labor unions saying, why won't you show up for our interests, even though you're relying on us for our votes and our time and our dollars? I think another crucial ingredient in the cake, let's say, that enticed Nancy Pelosi to show up for worker rights was our primary challenge. If she didn't face the most well-resourced, most experienced, and most expert challenge from the left that she has ever faced in her 30-year career, I'm quite confident that she would continue to relentlessly and unabashedly, unapologetically promote the corporate rule that she has for her 30 years in Congress. I don't want to overstate the case. She remains very much an agent of Wall Street. That's been revealed as recently as the coronavirus bailout package that moved through Congress. In spite of that, I've seen her at the margins pay some respect to progressive interests, at least rhetorically, in ways that I'm grateful for, and am excited to help continue developing into her policy commitments until we take the seat from her.
So we're going to stick on the topic of labor. According to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, California ranks 40th out of 50 states in terms of unemployment, with 3.9% unemployed. This number is even higher in your district at 4.1%. How do you account for this, and what steps should be taken that aren't currently being done to mitigate this issue?
Good question. Well, for what it's worth, I think the numbers you stated, unfortunately, radically understate the current reality, because I think those were the numbers before this week, the federal jobless claims spiked to a 400% increase over their all-time high 40 years ago. And I'm sure that the California numbers look much worse than that now. And I wouldn't be surprised if San Francisco's did as well. One of the biggest drivers of this you asked about before, which is just to say the limited protections for employee organizing that place workers at the mercy of their employers. Another factor in this is the gig economy. So the emergence of companies like Uber, Lyft, Instacart, these litany of Airbnb, the companies that promise effectively what they present as micro entrepreneurship opportunities, which ultimately present all of the joy and pain and blood and sweat and tears of work without any of the employee benefits or legal protections. That is another driver of the loss of traditional employment, both because those industries have disrupted preceding industries, Uber and Lyft, for instance, vis-a-vis taxis, and because those companies, the gig companies' business models are such that they have not always respected worker rights or done right by their employees. There's a further piece of the puzzle here in San Francisco, and you alluded to this before. That's the wealth disparity, which has driven alongside particularly the abdication of the city's interests by its elected representative in Washington, an affordable housing crisis that is vicious. Our housing market in San Francisco it's preposterous. And I understand that there is a crisis around the country. I understand that in few places is it as bad as it is demonstrated here, just because the demand for housing here is so high and the supply of new housing is so absent, that it has created very unfortunate price dynamics that have also led to mass displacement, eviscerated communities, in some respects really transformed the culture of the city. And our city struggles with ensuring the accessibility of our community to all of the people who have been a part of it. And I'm thinking particularly about, for instance, young couples with kids. So to have a child in San Francisco is the nearest thing to impossible, both because the housing market is so tight, and because it's a really tough place to raise a kid. It is a really expensive place. And so when people here form relationships, and if they want to form families, a lot of them end up leaving. And making sure that our community is hospitable and welcoming and accessible to people of various lifestyles and family structures is important. Making sure that our city remains available and accessible to people who have long lived here is important. And ensuring that there is a housing supply to meet the needs of new residents is important. There is a particular vision that would do that. It's called the Green New Deal for public housing. I support it. Speaker Pelosi does not. It would, among other things, invest substantial resources in the new generation of social housing owned by we the people, accountable to local communities and residents. That's exactly the vision that we haven't had here at any point in the past. And the fact that our real estate market, which is, a quintessential example of predatory capitalism, has so relentlessly squeezed working people. It's one of the reasons why we have displacement. It's one of the reasons why we have economic challenges, particularly at the less resourced rungs of the ladder. And I wouldn't say it's directly related to unemployment, but it's all related. These are intersectional problems. And maybe the last thing I just say there, as it relates to class in San Francisco, and it's a dovetail with the question you were asked earlier in terms of how do we get the message out to even wealthy people that democratic socialism might be in their interests. And the key to that is the climate crisis. A lot of people in San Francisco, and I'm thinking now of the people who are more highly compensated, a lot of people in San Francisco who you might write off as rich folks, and so people who are unlikely to see the wisdom in sharing our resources, a lot of those people are young enough to remember the 2008 financial crisis. Many of them work in technology and they're empiricists, and they recognize that the preceding generation of policymakers has frankly made decisions as if they were trying to engineer mass human death. Corporate predatory healthcare in a time of pandemic is that. Runaway corporate resource extraction and fossil fuel extraction in an age of climate chaos is also that. And a lot of those even very highly compensated people recognize that we need to make some really dramatic changes as a society, or we're going to run into a wall. Or, alternatively, to use a more gruesome metaphor, we'll be slitting the throats of the next generation before they have a chance to defend themselves. And I'm not willing to go down like that, and neither are they.
All right. So to follow up sort of on the housing crisis that you just mentioned, especially in San Francisco, you've called for ending homelessness, even specifically those who have served in the country's military. With
Yes.
the topic not really being a priority for most Americans, how do you sell to your constituents that this is an issue that's definitely worth tackling?
In San Francisco, it's an easy sell, frankly, if only because it's very visible here. It's much more visible here, I think, than in most parts of the country. And many of the unhoused people here were formerly housed members of our community, and now they're unhoused members of our community, and they have friends. And so these aren't just abstract random people. These are our friends and neighbors who are now living in the street because we don't have shelter for them. Yet we somehow have, billions upon billions of dollars to hurl at corporate bailouts and unnecessary fraudulent weapons programs, and who knows whatever other opportunity to shove money into our criminal president's pocket. In San Francisco, it's not a hard case to make at all. People very much recognize the need to address homelessness. I think one of the challenges emerges in how. And I think one of the opportunities we have here in San Francisco that I'm especially grateful for is to take established local leadership and represent it at the federal level. There are a whole bunch, and in that arena of housing, one in particular, local innovation here in San Francisco that's made a big difference, that could make a big difference nationally. San Francisco and New York at this point are the only communities in the country, we were the first, New York was second, to ensure a right to civil representation for people facing eviction. That means that in all parts of the country, because of the Supreme Court decided this, if you're charged with a crime, you get a public defender. But if your landlord comes after you to push you in the street, you don't have any help. You don't get a public defender for that in most parts of the country. In San Francisco and in New York, you do. You get a public defender whether you're charged with a crime or whether your landlord's trying to push you out of your place. And that right to civil representation is a crucial lever to keep people in their homes. It's one that we can take to Washington. It's one I'm eager to take to Washington. It's not a reform that Nancy Pelosi has supported. She has also presided, unfortunately, over the erosion of billions of dollars a year in federal subsidies that used to incentivize the inclusion of affordable units when property developers built new buildings. The budget for those programs has dropped something on the order of 70% while she has been in Congress. At the same time, the military spending has grown vastly greater than that, not only as a proportion, but in absolute dollar terms. It makes the savings, so to speak, on the affordable housing budget look infinitesimal. Another way of putting that is we have saved pennies in the $13 billion or so that has vanished in the federal budget for affordable housing, while hurling obscene amounts of resources to the tune of $21 trillion that the Pentagon hasn't been able to account for to the Department of Defense. And Nancy Pelosi is responsible for that. That misallocation of resources is laid bare in our faces every day in San Francisco. You can't, frankly, go to work without stepping over someone in the street. There are parts of, a couple different neighborhoods in the city where it's particularly visible, and I think all San Franciscans share an interest in making sure that all of our neighbors have housing. And this also gets particularly sharp during an age of pandemic. Your precise question was, how do we get San Franciscans to care in an age of pandemic, recognizing that there are people unsheltered in the street who could have shelter and thus could be less susceptible to falling ill to communicable diseases that would render the whole community at risk. I think everybody recognizes a very visceral shared interest, both in ensuring universal health care and in ensuring a right to housing. We have to get there. To get there, we're going to have to end some careers. And the very first career I'm looking forward to ending is that of the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, sending a signal across Washington, getting into Congress, and fighting to make this vision a reality.
All right. So you touched on this a little bit on the housing question, and that's the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It's one of the biggest crises of our generation. The outbreak is causing universal panic. So my question to you is, what has been lacking in the response from not only President Trump, but also from the Democratic leadership, and what would be your ideal solution to the problem?
The very first thing is a rent and mortgage moratorium. There is absolutely no reason that we are expecting people to make payments on time at a time when people can't work. The economy is effectively frozen, and yet people are still being expected to pay rents and mortgages, and that's foolish. The stimulus package that just passed Congress was largely a corporate bailout. It did thankfully include some resources for Americans, we the people of the United States. It didn't nearly include enough. A one-time cash payment is not enough to keep people in their homes. I'm very grateful for the leadership of Bernie Sanders in fighting for and ensuring that the pandemic relief package included an extension of unemployment benefits for people who need them. But the mortgage and rent moratorium is number one. Number two is universal health care. This is an absolute no-brainer. I hate to put it in such blunt terms, but it is unconscionably stupid that we have not adopted Medicare for all already. And the fact that we have been committed to a predatory corporate for-profit healthcare system is one of the crucial reasons that the United States is at the top of the pandemic list at the moment. We have the highest infection rate in the world, and we had a month's notice. It's absurd. It is such a glaring failure of leadership, and that failure is thoroughly bipartisan. Nancy Pelosi has refused not only to accept universal health care, but let's just even start at first principles. It was a fight just to get access to free testing. And where are we at now? You can get tests for free once the tests are there, which they're not, but you still don't get free care in the United States. So what is that about? We can't even take care of people in the midst of a pandemic, let alone get the preventive care we would need to keep these issues from becoming more problematic in the future. And recognizing that every pandemic in history has come in waves, we have to recognize that whatever is happening now is just the beginning of a further process. And if we want to get in front of it, if we want to diminish the impact of future pandemics, if we want to do everything we can to guard public health, we will make healthcare a human right. It's simple. It will be a job stimulus opportunity. It will create tons of new jobs. It will dramatically reduce the costs. It will increase the security of ill patients and their families in times of personal crisis. Frankly, that is priceless to those people. And it will keep people in their homes, because the leading cause of homelessness, just to tie this together with your previous question, is outrageously medical bankruptcy. And that is a sad stain on our country.
All right, so this is the last question I have, and it already has to do with something you touched on. With scientists giving us until the end of the decade to get our act together on the topic of climate change before it becomes completely irreversible, how would you use your position in Congress to usher in a green industrial revolution?
Lots of answers here. Substantively, I'm committed to the Green New Deal. I also want to nationalize fossil fuel extraction companies and dismantle the Pentagon. I want to emphasize the last piece of that. I touched briefly on the military-industrial complex and our wars for profit around the world when I was talking particularly about putting the D back in democratic socialism. It matters here too. The largest source, institutional source, not point source, but the largest institutional source of carbon pollution on our planet is the U.S. Department of Defense. I should say the U.S. Department of so-called Defense. The Pentagon is killing us, not only because it's the leading agent of military-industrial corruption and weapons manufacturing, but also because it just spews out the most carbon emission of any institution on our world. Now, to go further than that, what do we use our Pentagon and military-industrial complex for? Historically, if you look at the dozens of interventions, U.S. military interventions across countries in the global south over the last 70 years, they have consistently followed a pattern, and that is the pattern of, I'm using air quotes here, opening foreign markets to U.S. corporations. That is to say, resource plunder. We use our military so that U.S. corporations can extract materials, namely oil and gas, from underneath the soil of other countries. That's what we've done with our military for the last 70 years. And don't take my word for it. Eisenhower feared this. Smedley Butler talks about it in no uncertain terms. And the fact that we have exacerbated the climate crisis through every one of those interventions goes largely unnoticed, even by the climate justice movement, which is appropriately focused on climate and energy policy and multilateral solutions. At the end of the day, we cannot secure climate justice as long as the U.S. military-industrial complex remains unabated and unconstrained. We have to dismantle the military-industrial complex in order to secure climate justice. That is the particular hill on which I am planting a flag. There are other issues too, namely the Green New Deal, transitioning to 100% renewable energy, ensuring a just transition and a federal jobs guarantee. Here in California, one of the big things that's going to look like is getting a generation of folks for whom there are not market opportunities to do this work into the national forests to replicate indigenous forest management techniques to diminish the propensity of our national forests to the catastrophic wildfires that have left dozens of Californians dead in the past several years. Climate change is killing Californians already. And I'm very eager to do everything we can to diminish its impacts in the future, to stand with the future generations who don't have a chance to represent themselves, to make that transition to a new green economy, and to end the military-industrial corruption that's played such a enormous and unseen role in promoting the climate chaos that people are appropriately alarmed about today.
All right. Well, that's all the questions we have for you today. Would you like to take a moment to speak directly to the audience?
Sure. I appreciate that. I recognize that we live in a time of profound crises, and it might seem, frankly, very terrifying. And I would just say that at the same time that our crises seem overwhelming, the only thing that matches them is the immensity of our opportunities. And we can get there. I've seen this in my own life as an immigrant. I've seen radical transitions. My family lost our house when I was 16 to foreclosure, and it took me 10 years to get through undergrad, going to school at night while I worked for a series of banks of all things during the day. But I've seen impossible things become real, long after we put a person on the moon, and, long after we did things like ending slavery and getting women the right to vote. We've done unthinkable things in my lifetime, right? Apartheid in South Africa fell. The internet is a world-changing phenomenon. I've seen amazing things happen, and we can do those things again. We have risen to the challenges that we faced before as a society, and we can do it again if we assert ourselves. I am very inspired by many of our founding texts, and the inscription, the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they all mean a great deal to me. And this notion that we live in a land of the free and the home of the brave, it's why I am running for this seat. And I'll put it like this: a free people are not watched and monitored more than any other people in the history of humankind. A free people are not arbitrarily killed and shot by our public servants. A free people are not jailed by the millions and roped into an industrial slavery scheme, which is what our contemporary prison industrial complex is. And a brave people wouldn't let any of those things happen. And if we are a brave people, we need to reclaim our freedom. We have the opportunity, the incredible privilege of being able to do it at the ballot box. And I hope to preserve that opportunity. We have to defend our democracy in a time of crisis. It's why I'm here. I see the complicity of corporate Democrats in Republican corporate rule. We have to end it. I invite your support. If you live in San Francisco, vote for us. If you don't, volunteer, donate, check us out online, share the site. We're at ShahidForChange.us, and you can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter or on Facebook at ShahidForChange.
All right. Well, that's all we have for you guys today. If you'd like to support Shahid's campaign in any way possible, you can find the link to his website and all of his social media links down in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.